US President Donald Trump does not agree with the decisions made by the current head of the Federal Reserve. And he's made no secret of that. Since he returned to office, Trump has been pushing the current Fed chair, Jerome Powell, to significantly lower interest rates. Powell has refused to comply, drawing Trump's ire. But now his term is up and Kevin Warsh is Trump's pick to replace him. One question that's dominated his confirmation hearing in the Senate is whether Warsh will be committed to protecting the political independence of the Fed.
Are you going to be the president's human sock puppet?
Senator, absolutely not.
Are you going to be anybody's human sock puppet?
No, I'm honored the president nominated me for the position, and I'll be an independent actor if confirmed as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
To speak more about Kevin Warsh and the significance of who leads the US Federal Reserve, I'm joined now by Brian Jacobsen. He's Chief Economic Strategist at Annex Wealth Management. Brian, let's start with sock puppets. The exchange we just heard came after Democratic Senator Elisabeth Warren said that Warsh was, quote, Trump's chosen sock puppet, meaning that he would be controlled by Trump. Can you tell us why it would be a bad idea to put a sock puppet in charge of the Fed?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it would actually be a really bad idea to have a sock puppet in charge of the Fed. We used to also call those like lapdogs, and there are different ways to refer to that. But the idea is that Kevin Warsh, or whoever the Fed chair is, would just be doing the bidding of the president. We have seen in the past, not just in the United States, but in other countries, when the head of the central bank is basically there doing the bidding of the president, you don't get the best economic outcomes. One of the clearest examples of that could be during the 1970s. Richard Nixon had a very powerful personality, and he really leaned on the Federal Reserve chair back then. And we know that we had stagflation, so the combination of a stagnating economy with a high unemployment rate and inflation, very high inflation. And other countries have also shown that when monetary policy is not conducted in a way that's independent of the federal government, it can actually get some pretty bad outcomes.
So, Brian, can you explain to us now, I know in very clear terms, because some of our viewers won't be as familiar with this as we are, why is the Fed chair so important?
Yeah, so the Federal Reserve Chair is really the spokesperson for the Federal Open Market Committee. So that is part of the Federal Reserve, and they're the ones who determine monetary policy. So the creation of money in the economy, the level of short-term interest rates, the availability of credit for small and medium-sized businesses especially. And so the Federal Reserve Chair has that role in terms of monetary policy, but the Federal Reserve is much bigger than just monetary policy. It also does a lot of bank supervision. So that's another important role. I think where most people focus on the role of the Federal Reserve Chair is really as it relates to that Federal Open Market Committee and how monetary policy is set.
Right, looking a bit deeper here now, Warsh himself insists that he's committed to independent monetary policy. Let's just have a listen to what he said about this.
Very clear. Monetary policy independence is essential. Monetary policy makers must act in the nation's interest. Their decisions the product of rigor, deliberation, and unclouded decision-making. And as Senator Warren said, I do not believe that independence of monetary policy is threatened when elected officials state their views on rates.
Brian, tell us about the nominee. Who is Kevin Warsh?
Yeah, so Kevin Warsh actually has a very good pedigree, so a background in the economics and law and public policy circles. He served under President Bush as an economic advisor. He was one of the youngest members of the Federal Reserve back from 2006 through 2011. So he does have experience. He also since then has been teaching at Stanford University and doing research at the Hoover Institution. So I don't think there are a lot of people who would really question whether or not he has the credentials to become the chair of the Federal Reserve. I think the bigger questions are around his affiliation with President Trump as to whether or not, as we said at the outset, would he just be a sock puppet? And I believe that his history would suggest that he does fiercely believe in the independence of monetary policy. And to be honest, I was a little surprised when his name came to the top of the list from President Trump, because I thought, wow, this is a guy who is not necessarily going to do the bidding of the president.
Right, that's interesting because the way it's being viewed, US politics has become very partisan, as we know. But you're saying that basically he is qualified for this position. What else do we know about his economic philosophy and his principles?
Yeah, that's where it could be a dramatic change from what we have seen over the last few years. For many years, the Federal Reserve has really relied on looking at the world through the lens of saying that, like, it's about demand for goods and services. If the economy is overheating, that creates inflation. He takes a little bit different view, and I think that there are some nuances to it that are really important. One is it's a little bit more what we would say is on the supply side, where he really focuses on how important it is for like innovation and capital formation from businesses. So that would be the supply side of the economy. And that's where he thinks that high interest rates can actually choke off investment spending, future growth, and then actually create, in a weird way, more inflation. It's also a bit of a throwback to the theory of Milton Friedman, who was an economist. He came up with, or actually really investigated the theory of monetarism, where inflation is driven by the central bank printing money or making credit too readily available. So it might seem a bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, he thinks like low interest rates are good for the supply side of the economy, but it's bad for inflation. And so in a way, he kind of wants to try to thread the needle, where it's about let's not keep rates too high where it kills off growth, but let's not keep them too low where it's going to create too much demand and create inflation.
So do you think he's going to be the kind of Fed chairman who will focus on events as they come rather than having a sort of a blanket approach to things? You know, that in some cases he'll deal with interest rates, in other ways, in other cases he'll use other instruments to try and deal with the situation.
Yeah, I actually think that he would be very much focused on using interest rates for inflation and then collaborating with the Treasury as necessary if there are emergencies, like if we have another COVID situation or global financial crisis, that's where he thinks there can be some collaboration between the Treasury and the central bank to deal with those emergencies, but to quickly unwind that cooperation, to have it where it actually has an expiration date. And I think that's one of his major criticisms and where he would deviate most from what Chair Powell has done. Because if we think back to COVID, one of the big criticisms was that the Federal Reserve kept monetary policy too loose for too long. So Kevin Warsh would have basically cut that off a lot sooner.
Right, so let's circle back to this independence thing, because there was so much of that at the Senate today. And we saw Democratic Senator Elisabeth Warren. She really pressed Warsh about his independence. She zoomed in particular on the 2020 election, which was won by Joe Biden, but which Trump repeatedly claims that he won.
He said, when my guy, Kevin Warsh, is in there, we'll get the interest rates that Donald Trump, wants. So independence takes courage. Let's check out your independence and your courage. We'll start easy. Mr. Warsh, did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election?
We try to keep politics, if I'm confirmed, out of the Federal Reserve.
I'm just asking you a factual question. I need to know, I need to measure your independence and your courage.
Senator, I believe that this body certified that election many years ago.
I mean, how do you read that? Is that an answer or is that a non-answer? Is he kicking it into touch, as we say here?
Yeah, that was a non-answer, really. And I think that he felt a little awkward in that situation. He probably wanted to say, well, yes, of course, President Trump, current President Trump, lost that election. And in a way, he was saying that by saying that they certified it. But he didn't want to come out and, what we would say, bite the hand that feeds him, right? The one who nominated him is, he doesn't necessarily want to say anything to upset him too much. But what we could see is a little bit of what we also call buyer's remorse, where if we think back to President Trump's first term, he nominated Chair Powell to the position of chair. And shortly thereafter, he started complaining about Chair Powell because Powell wasn't doing what Trump thought that he would do. Similar thing might happen with Kevin Warsh. If he is true to his knittings and his previous work and research, I believe that he would actually not be able to cut interest rates dramatically and not necessarily really be, I mean, it would be a great way for him to assert his independence, but suddenly we could see some of those Truth Social posts complaining about Kevin Warsh fairly soon.
I mean, I've seen it said that, some critics saying that Fed independence is exaggerated, given that it's a creature of Congress, which, after all, created it in 1913. What do you think of that?
It's very true. Congress created the Federal Reserve, and it has set the parameters for what it can do. It's given it its objective. It's the reason in the United States, under the Federal Reserve Act, the Fed has the mandate to pursue full employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. Compare that to the European Central Bank, which has one focus, which is with inflation. Same thing with the Bank of England. So it is true that Congress really has created the Fed and it can control the Fed. Now, where the independence comes in is the way in which monetary policy is set. So if we think about the terms of these governors on the board, they're long and they're staggered. So it makes it very difficult for a sitting president to be able to pack the board with his or her at some point, his people. And so that's one of the sources of independence. Plus, the funding of the Fed comes from the Fed itself, from the services it provides, the interest it earns on the securities it holds. And so it's really outside of the normal appropriations process. So I would say those are really the two things that make the Fed, I would call it more insulated as opposed to independent.
Another aspect that people have looked at with Kevin Warsh is that he would be the richest Fed chair in a long time. He reportedly has over $100 million in assets. Are there any possible financial conflicts of interest?
Thankfully, he said that he would divest himself of a lot of those holdings. We also have to remember that quite a bit of that money is his wife's because he kind of married into it. He has made a decent amount of money prior to his time in public service and since then as well. But having somebody with those types of resources, I think that it can create some optics around, is this just another rich guy who's setting policy for the rest of us? So I think it's more of a problem of the optics as opposed to the reality, because I don't think that his financial dealings, if anything, it would be put in a trust or he would divest of them to not create those conflicts of interest.
Another aspect is a very common theme in our age, is that Warsh's name appeared in the Epstein files. Now, that was also brought up by Senator Warren during the hearing, although there's nothing made public that links him to any wrongdoing. Let's just listen to what was said.
I think people will ask about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. As you know, Mr. Warsh's name appears in the publicly disclosed Epstein files. Obviously, there's a lot more that the Department of Justice has not exposed. But even in those, there are questions that arise about his business dealings and whether there are entanglements between Mr. Warsh and Mr. Epstein on business activities.
Do you think Warsh's appearance in documents related to Jeffrey Epstein could complicate the appointment process?
I think that Senator Warren is really bringing it to light. And as one of the former Supreme Court Justice Brennan once said, is that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So you bring it to light, you have the investigations, and based on the publicly available information, as she correctly pointed out, publicly available because we don't know everything else, is it looks like there aren't really any implicating ties between them. There are a large number of people whose names were mentioned in there who don't necessarily have anything to do with him. And so I think that it is, again, one of those issues where it's more about the optics of it as opposed to the reality of it really creating some sort of complication for how he would set policy.
Right. So what happens now? I mean, we've seen these issues raised. He's addressed them. Does this mean that his appointment is essentially a done deal?
No, that's part of the fun of this, isn't it? It is not a done deal. In the past, it would have been, right? That the president would nominate somebody, they would have the hearing, there would be a vote, and they get the approval. But Senator Tillis, a Republican who is retiring, and so he probably feels free to be able to speak his own mind here, says that he doesn't want to vote on the nomination until the investigation into the Federal Reserve, and specifically Chair Powell, with the management of the building project, until that is done, until the Department of Justice investigation is gone. And where we have basically it could lead to a 12-12 split as far as the votes, in which case he could be stuck in limbo as far as with his nomination, as long as this investigation continues. So the hearings that we had today, this was, very interesting, but it does not mean that everything is done and that he will indeed step into the role of chair as when Chair Powell's term is set to expire.
Right. So if it does happen that he is confirmed, though, how do you think the markets would react?
I think that the markets might actually not necessarily like it that much. I don't think it would be that negative. It's just that the reality is that he has been a hawk, and we use that term to refer to somebody who is really focused on fighting inflation, right? So they don't want to run the economy hot, but he is really a hawk, and I don't think that he has changed his feathers that much to a dove, where the market is going to view him as really leading the Fed, the rest of the members, because keep in mind, this is a committee. It is majority rules. There are 12 members on that committee, and whatever the majority says, that's what sets policy. We have seen the chair be in the minority. Now, it's been since the 1930s that we have seen that, but perhaps he's not going to be able to rally the other members of the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, around the idea that they need to start cutting rates and start cutting them now.
And finally, Brian, just for anyone outside the US who's sort of wondering how they may be affected by all of this, how important is the position of Fed chair for the rest of the world?
I think that the position of Fed chair is very important for everybody in the world for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, U.S. growth and inflation outcomes influence growth and inflation in other countries as well. The United States runs a very large trade deficit despite tariffs that had been imposed, meaning that we import a lot from other countries. And so growth here is very important for growth everywhere. Also, in terms of financial conditions, the Federal Reserve Chair can really influence financial conditions, whether it's the value of the dollar, the level of interest rates, the level of the stock market. And that clearly has implications for people who hold wealth and assets around the world. So while we'd like to think that one person doesn't wield so much power, they do wield quite a bit of influence.
We'll have to leave it there. Brian Jacobsen, Chief Economic Strategist at Annex Wealth Management. Thanks for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what do you think about Donald Trump's push to name Kevin Warsh as chairman of the Fed? Do you think he's the right person for the job? Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.